Thank you all for joining us. I'm Heather Jasmine, the program coordinator for the Cheshire Academy for Lifelong Learning at Keene State College. That was the COVID-safe performance of Jaffrey-Rindge Middle School's chorus under the direction of Andrew LeCrier, performing Love is Love is Love, composed by Abby Battinis. We are so pleased to have you with us for this important event, and we are especially pleased to be joined by Dr. Walter Fluker. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Fluker will be answering questions following his prepared remarks as time permits. You may submit your questions at any time during this presentation. We're going to begin today's event with Mr. Owen Houghton of the Jaffrey-Rindge Martin Luther King Committee.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to represent the Jaffrey-Rindge Martin Luther King Committee for our annual celebration, which traditionally begins with bell ringing. We have a Liberty Bell presentation, which comes out of Philadelphia. It rang today at noon, and the Paul Revere Bell at the United Church of Jaffrey, usually calling us to a candlelight celebration, was rung again this noon. So welcome, all of you who live in what Dr. King described as the Great World House. There's plenty of room here on this virtual platform for you to discover the reasons why we celebrate his birthday on this date. The J.R. Martin Luther King Committee is grateful to our sponsor partner, Keene State College Cheshire Academy for Lifelong Learning, and many, many other patrons and community members who support this annual commemoration, particularly Franklin Pierce University, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, the Community Center of Jaffrey, the Park Theater, Mark and Sharon Teeger, and other folks who have provided the committee with some support. Our 2021 theme is Our Great World House, Plenty Good Room. We begin with an interpretation of relevant passages from Dr. King's Nobel Peace Prize lecture by the newest member of our committee, Franklin Pierce University student representative Saba Faragala, an international scholar from Sudan.
Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested story plots for future stories. the most prominently underscored being this one. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslim and Hindu. A family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. This often misunderstood and misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the niches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response, which is little more than emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which is all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us hope that this spirit will become the order of the day. As Arnold Tony B. says, love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of life and good against the damning choice of death and evil. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word. We can no longer afford to worship the god of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. History is cultured with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued this self-defeating path of hate. Love is the key to the solution of problems of the world. Thank you.
Highlighting our commemoration this day, we are delighted to share with our audience Dr. Walter Earl Fluker, the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor Emeritus of Ethical Leadership at Boston University School of Theology and editor of the Howard Thurman Papers. Thurman's influence led Dr. Fluker to study and practice ethical leadership as a consultant, writer, and lecturer recognized worldwide. As a spiritual activist, he is a pioneer in nonviolence movement, exploring the quest for living together with all of our differences in this one big world. Dr. Fluker, welcome to our little corner of that world. You grace us with your keynote talk, Plenty Good Room, the quest for democratic space in MLK's vision of the great world house. And as a reminder, Dr. Fluker will entertain questions with discussion following the presentation. Please submit your questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to get us started tonight. It's obvious to me that we're a singing group. And though we are separated by space, bodily and physical space, but we do have digital space and what I'll refer to later as democratic space. So everyone can sing. And it's the words of an old, as it was called, Negro spiritual, entitled Plenty Good Room. I'm a terrible singer, but you should be able to at least pick up the melody and the rhythm. It goes like this: plenty good room, plenty good room, plenty good room in my Father's kingdom, plenty good room, plenty good room. Choose your seat and sit down. Why don't you try that with me from where you are? Plenty good room, plenty good room, plenty good room in my Father's kingdom, plenty good room, plenty good room. Choose your seat and sit down. Good evening. I extend greetings to Peggy, Ueda, Heather Jasmine, and the MLK Committee, other program participants, these fine educational and civic institutions, and so many others who worked to bring this celebration to fruition. These things do not happen by magic. They're the result of hard and sometimes perilous work. I take as my point of the departure in this address the words of this old Negro spiritual, as they were called, plenty good room. In the midst of unspeakable bondage, living in a world that was too crowded to grant them rights to full humanity and the dignity of citizenship, these Black and unknown bards envision a world where there was plenty good room. When these creative theologians overheard the stories about heaven from their white masters and a world beyond time and history, they perceived more than a place for them elsewhere. Rather, they signified on and imaginatively reconstructed the very concept of heaven as a place of plenty good room. They believed that there was plenty good room in the present because the God whom they served was not captive to time prescribed by the master, a time of commodification and incarceration of Black bodies. In the words of my good friend, the late Charles Long, these spirituals, like this one, they resituate the problem of race and give it an inward focus and set a new rhythm for time. These words speak volumes to where we are as a nation, and as it calls us to remember, retell, and relive its story in this strange period of American history that is returning to a time that we thought we had bypassed. We are witnessing a reversal of time that I sometimes call American post-racialism, a return to the language of America first, and let's make America great again, which is a reconfiguration of time and history. As a new generation of activists and freedom fighters engage the long and complex history of race in the US and beyond, while negotiating the COVID pandemic, which has revealed the deep systemic issues of domestic and state violence and disparities in health, education, economics, demographic locations, and more. We must take a good look at the ways in which this new moment calls us to reimagine our futures. Our imagined futures are necessary because of the ambiguities and the contingencies of the present. And they are possible because of the gift of spirit and transcendence, which allows us to stand on the mountaintop with Martin Luther King Jr. and overlook the complex and jagged contours of history, patiently and painfully waiting for a new generation of leaders like yourselves to write new visions that enable us to live and struggle authentically in the context of the present. More than any other American leader in the 20th century, Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the intersection of what I like to call where worlds collide. It was King's spiritual genius that provided for him the essential assets and tools to lead a revolution of values that expanded the American moral grammar and culture from parochial applied democratic principles to concrete proposals for inclusiveness, diversity, and action. This amazing feat, performed in a brief period of our history from 1954 to 1968, was no doubt the nation's finest example of what the Jewish theologian Martin Buber called turning. He asked us to turn from ourselves to the other, to maybe see the other for the first time in all of her difference and splendor and beauty, the other. In doing so, King changed the leadership equation. Public leadership no longer belonged to the strict province of power, position, and privilege. It also was leadership for a marginalized moral minority, those whom King labeled as transformed nonconformist. What a word this is for us as we commemorate the life, legacy, and we must say assassination of one of America's greatest prophets, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We too need to return to this old spiritual, I think, and ask whether there is room enough for the poor, disenfranchised, and hopeless in America's future. Nearly 2 weeks ago, as we were rejoicing down here in Georgia and throughout the country over the results of the January 5th senatorial runoff elections, on that very next day, troubled and misguided self-proclaimed patriots, incited by a mad leader who was willing to watch democracy burn, rioted in the halls of the Capitol building. King challenges us, therefore, during this season of dread and possibility, to dream again and to hope again, and this dream of plenty good room. So this is a call to dreamers. This is a summons to a new generation of leaders, transformed nonconformists, who, like King, are willing to go into strange territory without a map and to run to the mountain and see the promised land of plenty good room. There is indeed plenty good room in our nation for a diverse and inclusive society, what the late historian John Hope Franklin called the land of room enough. But first, we must create space for others in our precious but precarious experiment in democracy. We must create and share democratic space. I agree with Professor Khan of the All India Institute in New Delhi, who says democratic space is an unwritten permission to think, a fundamental consideration and respect granted by a state to its subjects to raise a voice of dissent and disagree. It is this democratic space, he writes, which forms the basis of a vibrant democracy. I add, though, this precious privilege, however, to exercise the freedom of speech and assembly does not give us the right to injure, maim, and kill those with whom we disagree. 5 years after the end of President Barack Obama's 2-term presidency, the ignominious demise of Donald J. Trump as the 45th president, and the inauguration of the 46th president of the United States, Joseph R. Biden, there's a deep and profound issue that threatens the very future of our republic and democracy. In the midst of the ideological divide of politics during this new season of making America great again, we have been revisited by an older, more insidious problem. It is a campaign to reconfigure time and space back to an era where certain non-white people knew their place in the racial architecture of this nation. One scholar calls it the house that race built. This challenge has a long and difficult history that calls us to join these brave harbingers of democracy from our past in this critical passage of time and to choose our seats and sit down. During the spring of 2006, I traveled throughout South Africa lecturing on ethical leadership. One of my visitations was in Durban, South Africa. My host took me to Pietersmaritzburg, the township famous for an incident early in the career of Mahatma Gandhi. In 1893, Gandhi arrived in Durban to serve as legal counsel to the merchant Dada Abdullah. Early in his employment, he was asked by Abdullah to take a trip to Pretoria in the Transvaal. Traveling by train, Gandhi acquired a first-class ticket and had proceeded to his compartment when a railway official requested that he remove himself to the van compartment, since coolies and non-whites were not permitted in first-class compartments. When Gandhi protested and refused to comply, he was violently thrown off the train and his luggage tossed onto the platform. I spoke with his great-granddaughter, Ella Gandhi, and she said Gandhi stayed at Pietersmaritzburg station in the cold of that winter night and began to reflect on his duty. Should he stay back and fight for his rights or return to India? He reasoned with himself that his own hardship was superficial, only a symptom of the deep disease of color prejudice. This incident, you may know, inspired Gandhi to begin his career protesting against laws discriminating against Indians in South Africa. Gandhi used the incident to mount a movement of Hindus and Muslims that sought equal justice in pre-apartheid South Africa. As I stood in the train station, which is now a memorial dedicated to his courageous action after that incident, I reflected on a similar event that involved an African-American seamstress named Rosa Parks, who also had been told to give up her seat to a white passenger. Rosa Parks' legendary refusal to give up her seat became the flashpoint of the modern civil rights movement in America. In fact, when she sat down, Martin Luther King Jr. stood up. On February 1, 1960, four young men, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, students at North Carolina A&T State University, a primarily Black university. Despite the segregated statutes prohibiting Black people to eat in the downtown Woolworth store, decided there was plenty good room, and they chose their seats and sat down. They were denied service, but that did not stop them. They sat in their seats until the store closed and returned the next day with 16 more students. On the next day was 16, and on the third day, there were 60 students. And by the fourth day, over 300 people chose their seats and sat down. Their courageous actions gained momentum and sit-ins spread throughout the South. And this was a significant factor in the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which changed the course of the modern civil rights movement. My friends, the struggle for plenty good room requires revolutionary patience, irrepressible hope, and the insatiable desire to be free. It is important, therefore, to note that King's vision of freedom, equality, and justice was not a solo act. Rather, it arose out of the solidarity of men and women, young people and elders who decided to choose their seats and sit down. King is a product from a rich and vibrant tradition of protest, of which he was its most noble heir. King's vision of the beloved community grows out of this context of struggle. Indeed, for King, the beloved community is an argument for sharing space with others in a democratic society where there is plenty good room for everybody. Long before Martin Luther King Jr. was catapulted into national and international fame after the Montgomery bus boycott, long before he stood before the Lincoln Memorial and declared to a pilgrimage of thousands that America had written its citizens of color a bad check that had come back marked insufficient funds, long before his campaigns for open accommodations and voting rights, long before his outspoken stance on an unjust war in Vietnam. His dream of the beloved community was born in the violent context of the Deep South, where the inseparable twins of white racism and economic injustice had relegated Black people to the status of things, non-persons without names and destinies. The dream of community, which sent him forth into the segregated South and into the teeming ghettos of the urban North, was nurtured by a deep sense of mission and purpose that was the rich legacy of his forebears and the long, torturous struggle of brave men and women of every color and creed who had come before him, who refused to believe that equality and freedom were the special birthrights of color and class. They believed there was plenty good room for all people. I told you I was a Baptist preacher. I only have about 40 more minutes. Before the moronic diatribes and tweets of Donald Trump, Martin Luther King Jr. too sought to make America great. I want you to hear that again. Before the moronic diatribes and tweets of Donald J. Trump, Martin Luther King Jr. too sought to make America great. But his was not through the demeaning and despicable acts that we are hearing from our current president and his sycophants. King believed that there was room enough for other voices, other beliefs and opinions that the narrow, myopic proposal of making America great again signals. In the famous I Have a Dream speech of 1963, King offered this conditional challenge to his fellow citizens. He declared, and if America is to be a great nation, not great again, but if it is to become a great nation, we must let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, from the mighty mountains of New York, from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, from the curvaceous slopes of California, from Stone Mountain of Georgia, from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee, from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside, King said, let freedom ring. His rhetorical flourish on freedom was not idealistic and starry-eyed. Rather, it was carved out of the deep experience of racial suffering and domination in the segregated South. This dream cost him dearly. He paid with his life. During his latter years, though, King had much to say about what he perceived as the global challenges that history had placed upon his time. King believed that there would need to be a reckoning with Western imperialism's own presuppositions about power. Before his tragic death in 1968, he reminded this nation that we no longer live in a small house, a house that race built, but rather we have inherited a world house of interrelatedness and interdependability. He suggested in clear and strident language that we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters or die apart as fools. During his latter years, King was acutely aware of the need for a broader interpretive framework for understanding what he perceived as a crucial passage in history. He wrote, "The civil rights movement in the US is a special American phenomenon which must be understood in the light of American history and dealt with in terms of the American situation. But on another and more important level, what is happening in the United States today is a significant part of a world development." He further suggested that the struggles of African Americans must be understood in light of a shifting of the West's basic outlooks and philosophical presuppositions about power. He argued, "We have inherited a large house, a great world house in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim," he wrote, "Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never live apart again, must learn somehow to live together with each other in peace." He adds, "However, deeply American Negroes are caught in the struggle to be at last home in the homeland of the United States, we can never ignore the larger world house in which we are also dwellers. Equality with whites will not solve the problems of either whites or Negroes if it means equality in a world society stricken by poverty and in a universe doomed to extinction by war." I do close now. This understanding of the radical nature of the dream of the world house will make some people uneasy, especially those who are content to see business as usual and are suggesting that we can govern by making deals with oligarchs and plutocrats as we experience the utter pillage and plunder of our most cherished ideals of democracy and the attendant ambiguities and concerns about our nation's future. The vision of a world house is no longer the distant imaginings of a utopian dreamer, but may be the only viable option for peaceful coexistence in this nation and on this planet. All around the nation today, Americans and other long-standing international allies are asking whether this dream of a world house might have a chance. But if we are to be true to King's vision, if we really believe that negotiation and peaceful resolution are better options than domestic terrorism and war, then it is important that we understand that the dream of Dr. King is not one for sentimentalists and pop patriots. It is not an isolated episode in the chronicles of American history. Rather, it is the ongoing struggle against racism, economic and environmental injustice, violence and war, gender and sexual discrimination, and all forms of oppression that eat away at the heart of our body politic like an insidious cancer. It is a call for new beginnings. It is a call for a new vanguard of visionaries who are willing to go into the no trespassing zones of this world system and to declare boldly and courageously that the future of our communities, our nation, and indeed the world hinge on moral foundations. to accept the radical implications of his world house means that we can no longer feign ignorance and invisibility in regard to the political and economic scenarios that determine our corporate destiny. Our struggle is a mandate to claim our inheritance of dignity and self-worth, and as human beings, to create room for all God's people. We must choose our seats and sit down. And I thank you.
Dr. Fluker, thank you so much for sharing your insights. As you know, our community has been very excited for the opportunity to speak with you.
I'm excited too.
And we've proposed a number of questions for you. And the community has proposed a number of questions for you. And of those, 2 have been selected, which seem to sum up those we received. We'll give you the opportunity to answer those now, and then as time permits, take additional questions from the audience that are entered in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the webinar screen. The first question is, Dr. Fluker, if President Biden's senior team asked you for advice on how to best heal the deep divisions currently facing this country now, what 3 specific things or steps would you advise him to take?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm probably not the easiest person to ask that question, but I really appreciate what President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have already begun to do in terms of laying out where we're going. There are 3 major areas that I would, and I can name a few others. I think this administration, because of what I've referred to as the ambiguity and contingencies of the present, consider this. You have an inauguration that is being staged. Simultaneously, the nation's capital is occupied by the National Guard, the CIA, FBI. It's a scary moment. What I would counsel and what he's already doing is for him to show both empathy and imagination. Empathy for people, many people around the country struggling with COVID and dealing with this quote unquote potential Holocaust in this nation. We need a leader who empathizes with the deep fear and what people are feeling in very personal and local spaces beyond national remedies, but how do we make the local also feed the national? Health, of course, is important, priority, and I would make that priority number 1. He has to do that at the same time and juggle the greatest economic depression since the Great Depression. Thirdly, I think going forward, he and Vice President Harris, soon to be Vice President Harris, will need to model for us how they make decisions based not simply on expediency, especially political expediency and transactional leadership, but based on some deep-seated moral foundations that seek justice, and justice that seeks compassion for the least of these. Those are quick responses. I'm certainly willing to speak more to those.
Thank you so much. I know that we are also trying to pay attention to time, so I think we'll just go on to the second question. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King made a speech to the Barrett Junior High School in Philadelphia entitled, "What is Your Life's Blueprint?" How do you believe Dr. King's guidance applies to our nation's youth today?
I remember that speech, and he highlights 2 major themes. One is the need to be aware of one's own inherent dignity and worth. I think one of the greatest challenges, especially for emerging leaders, is to be able to embrace, despite what anybody else says, personally, socially, or through social media, that I'm valuable. So King is saying you must hold on to your inherent worth and dignity. This drives certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of character. The second theme he appealed to was excellence in whatever you do. He says, whether you're a street sweeper, sweep the street like Michelangelo uh, painted paintings. This is the idea. So he leaves us with some important, um, I think, not just values but practices. Practicing personal worth is so important now for individuals and groups, but also the deep, deep need to strive for excellence, for virtuosity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a little time for questions from the audience. And we remember those are entered down at the bottom in the Q&A. And we do see several already. One question we have, as we face shrinking usable land and resources from the reckless abuse of our planet and giving differential rates of population growth amongst various people competing for them, along with historical inequalities in land and resource ownership, how can we create a democratic framework for the sharing of physical space and resources to avoid a global war?
One of the areas that King was not as outspoken on, and which I think is our task, is like he throws a torch to us. When we talk about democratic space, it must be space that includes um, non-human flourishing, is the language I like to use. We've become fowlers, as Howard Thurman used to say, of our own nests. And it will be hard to talk about democratic space in a world that is on fire. And one of our greatest challenges, and some would say our utmost challenge, even now for Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris and others, will be to protect our environment from the pillage that has taken place, especially over the last 4 years with multinational corporations and greedy and insane puppeteers who hide behind the curtains of social fiction and manipulate the mindscape. That's that's my response. I wish we had more time because I think it's one of the major challenges we have before us.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we had so many questions. Now they were covering my mute button. Before we go on, Dr. Fluker, I wanted to see if you could adjust your camera a little bit. We can't see your face anymore. Awesome. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. And that's because I've been trying to open my question and answer box. It won't yield today. Is this better?
Yes, thank you very, very much. Another question is, what is your input for those of us trying to have our friends who very strongly believe the real truth is in those news sources that we don't hear from? Those who delve into the lies and mechanisms to get people out of the democratic mode and into resurrection.
My. I think one of the challenges as well, we have so many, we have a plethora of things. It's a many-headed hydra, right? And one of those certainly is the ways in which, we use and we're used by the social media. But the more fundamental question is the purpose of technology. Technology is essentially a tool, but in some strange and twisted way, we've allowed the tool to become us. It's no longer the tool or artificial intelligence that works on our behalf. We're now shaped and structured by the very tools we've invented. King spoke to this early on. He said, we can fly into outer space, but we have trouble living in inner space. I think this is a great moment for those of us who care deeply about spirituality. And I should suggest to you, I'm not naming any particular religion. I'm not even sure all that religion is necessarily the best way to go, because I saw people praying in the House chambers. I mean, in the Senate chambers just last week after they had broken into the Capitol building. So the question for us is not whether or not you're religious. It's, as the old slave singers used to say, is you got good religion? Is it any good? Does it help inspire others to be better people? Does it inspire justice and compassion? Justice without compassion is deadly, procedural, but only compassion, which is at the heart of justice, will restore people to one another and to themselves. Uh, so that's a response. And all of these, again, are many headed questions, but that's my immediate response.
And it was wonderful. Thank you so much. The next question. What role might higher education play in a moral and just education and partnerships with communities?
I've been working for the past 30, maybe 40 years, but certainly 30 years in what I call ethical leadership. And I've actually had several massive online courses where, where I had a global reach for students all over the world. And I think that education at its best is education which points us to ethical and moral foundations, not just simply being moral. Being moral by itself does not get us there, but learning how to discern, deliberate, and decide on the correct action for our time. And education has a critical role for creating citizens. Over the past 30 years, we've almost taken civic education out of the classroom. And I dare say that some of what we're witnessing now has to do with our failure as educational institutions to give as much weight to civic education as we have to science, technology, mathematics, and so on.
Thank you so much.
Is you
Actually, this is a question from a college professor. So we'll go on with our next question that ties right in. Dr. Fluker, thank you for your words and presence today. A world house with plenty good room is a vision we need. How can good people respond to all the new walls going up around public buildings, between countries, and so forth? Thank you.
Two very quick responses. One is I must work on my space. Democratic space begins with a democratic life. That is an openness towards diversity and inclusiveness and the ability to hear the other in the other's own voice, in all of her difference and in all of her magnificence. That's one, my own space. But my space, if it's only occupied by the big I, and if every decision that I make is a decision based upon self interest, rightly understood, then I'm going to have some major problems. Our rugged individualism in this country, our negative understandings of freedom must give way to mutuality, to reciprocity, and to different ways of being in relation with the other, especially the other who is different from me. Difference doesn't mean evil.
Very good reminder. Thank you. Um, Another question. I can't help but feel the connection between Reverend Dr. King, Dr. Howard Thurman, and a book on your bookshelf, Thomas Merton. Please address the spiritual foundation represented by these mentors for our ongoing struggle, and thank you.
I use the phrase transform nonconformist. And these three gentlemen, and there are plenty of women who didn't make it to the stage, the public stage during their time. I'm thinking of Dorothy Day as well, even as I say this, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. The point of spiritual transformation being linked, inextricably linked to social transformation, I think is the key. One of the dynamic themes of Merton, Thurman, King, Day, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and so many others is this dynamic of spirituality and social transformation. In other words, what I'm working on in the world is also a part of the very thing or things that prevent me from being myself, from coming to full realization of my own self and my own being. So I work feverishly in the world to change the world, because at the same time, I'm working to release myself from domination and bondage. It's a wonderful conversation. One day, invite me back and we'll talk forever about Thurman, King, and Merton, and others like that.
Thank you very much. We'll look forward to that. We do have a few more, and I think we have a little bit more time.
Plenty good room.
I think that I kind of already have the idea of what this question might get for an answer, but do you believe that strong moral leadership from Washington, from the new president, is critical for bringing the country together without further violence?
Yes, I believe strong moral leadership is important, but I do make a distinction between ethics and morality. They're interrelated, but ethics is more like the science of morality. It allows you to stand outside of moral claims, moral relations, and ask questions about does this respond to duty? And what is that duty? Is this simply about measurable outcomes that are quantifiable? Or is it also about what makes community? And how do I incorporate this into the larger narratives, personal narratives, mine, and the larger nation and world of which I'm a part? Ethics is very important for this time. And leaders who are not aware of the distinction between ethics and simple morality are very dangerous, often very confused human beings. And I'm on the record for that. A lot of moral people around here.
Thank you very much. For those of us who were appalled by the actions of fellow Americans who mobbed the Capitol and the inflammatory remarks of the president prior to the riot, what counsel would Dr. Thurman be offering us as to how to respond to them?
Can you state that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. For those of us who were appalled at the actions of fellow Americans who mobbed the Capitol and the inflammatory remarks of the president prior to the riot, what counsel, it says, what counsel would Dr. Thurman be offering us as to respond to them?
For those who are actually involved in that behavior. Thurman, if that's what the questioner is asking, Thurman believed that within all of us, there is a space for creating common ground. He says we often miss it because we're too busy and too attached to the things that are outside of us, and we're not looking deeply within ourselves. So my point is that as many people are manipulated by social media, technology, by big voices, by reality stars, and so on, maybe finding ways to listen to the deeper inner voices and finding the springs, the wells of our own individuality. That requires work and it requires a community. Uh, I wish churches and mosques and temples and synagogues were available to do this work. Sometimes, unfortunately, some churches are on the side that's creating the problem. I'm looking for different kind of ways, and this is especially to younger generations. Thurman's word to a group of us many years ago before he died, in his presence, he said, I sometimes think that a new religion is in the making. He says, my only regret is that I may not be around to see it. I think we need to rethink, reimagine ways in which we create community of spirit, body, and mind. It's a new opportunity, especially given this time, to reimagine ourselves.
Thank you very much. I think that's a perfect way to end. I really appreciate that insight, especially now.
Mm.
So it's been both an honor and a pleasure to work with you on this project. Thank you again. I'd like to invite Owen Houghton to share concluding remarks and introduce our closing music.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Fluker. You've brought to us a super joy and insight into the inspiration of Dr. King, advancing our understanding of the need for harmony and peace on earth. His vision of a world house in which we live together is such a powerful message and so needed in today's world. May this annual celebration inspire us to practice Dr. King's example, which leads us all to be human rights activists with courage and especially acts of love and kindness in our own contributions to a better world. Let peace on earth begin with us. The MLK Committee is grateful, certainly, for all of the interest in this program and looks forward to seeing everyone next year, maybe under different circumstances. The mention of Howard Thurman gives me the opportunity to tell you that we have online presentations, and our committee has become so fascinated through Dr. Fluker with Howard Thurman that I suspect that that's going to be the theme for next year in some ways. I want you to go to MLK Celebration Jaffrey-Rindge on Facebook and find Backs Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story. You'll be amazed at his power and how important he is to both Martin Luther King Jr. and to Dr. Fluker. We want you now to enjoy the recessional song, Shine Your Light, in which refugees around the world, featuring Grammy Award winner Ricky Cage and 24 refugee musicians, join voices in a song of hope and kindness.
امید خانه را رنگین کمانی سازیم عشق را درون خود یابه نوید تازه را از سر جهانی سازه کینه را از قلب خود رانه
مهربان باشیم با هم از دل بخندیم هر دم شادمان باشیم با هم زندگی کنیم در هم Let's do this, it's our time Let's do this, it is time to shine your light Let's do this, it is time to shine your light It is time to shine your light
مهربان باشی در زندگی تو زندگی زیباست باشید امیدوار
قدر هم دانید محبت ورزید دل را به کام هم دیگر بستید عشق و محبت سرمایه ماست در راه خدمت باشید هم Let's do this, it's our time Let's do this, it is time to shine a light Let's do this, it is time to shine your light Shine your light بیا که تا چرا